criminology, and technology. More and more, they're inseparable.
So what we're looking at here is a demo instance.
But using tech to prevent crimes before they actually happen? Yep. It's called predictive policing. It's a trend that has others worried that bias might still be built into the software.
It matters how you've trained that computer. The computer is only going to do what you tell it to do with the data that you give it.
You're not going to help me? You're just going to sit there reading?
Meet Flatbush Girl, a web sensation among the Orthodox Jewish community, where the internet is often considered a threat to tradition.
Flatbush Girl is the character that I play to unify a very fragmented community.
Adina Miles not only created the character, but as head of her own media company, she's dragging her corner of the world into the digital age.
One of my favorite kinds of businesses to come into and introduce to social media are the men who don't have access to smartphones.
So this food is actually made from dead fungi and sugar.
How to have fun with fungi. At Brooklyn's GenSpace, the world's first community biology lab, citizen scientists are signing up to learn bioengineering.
Technology, and then go into the lab, which is all right behind you, and try biotechnology for the first time.
You could say interest is mushroom.
Blue oyster mushrooms.
Are they
And
delicious?
actually, they're incredibly tasty.
When's the last time you ate a mushroom?
Last night.
So, sign up for the next 30 minutes as we go in on the question, tech too far? Thanks, Brian. I love you too. I love you guys. I'm just sitting here taking a bath, both of you, and how much I love you. This is a real text message sent to me by my father, the same man who named me BRIAN. Yeah, my dad is a mush. He's also not a very good proofreader. But he is doing his level best to stay in the game, because few things age you more than letting technology pass you by. And while my dad works to master the talk-to-text function, an entire community of entrepreneurs is innovating advances in everything from robotics to nanotechnology here at New Lab in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a last-century hub of wartime readiness reborn as a temple to tech. But as the American marketplace becomes more about intellectual property than the 5 o'clock whistle, the concern goes much further than an old guy who can't work his cell phone. Sorry, Dad. For better or for ill, there seems to be no corner of our lives that remain untouched by technology. Algorithms are stacking your Netflix queue and informing law enforcement practices across the country. Robots are making the clothes on our back, and an entire community, self-segregated and steeped in tradition, is facing what it means to answer the call of the Wi-Fi. So for the next half hour, I invite you to get a little closer to your Black Mirror as we go in on Tech in Brooklyn. In 2016, Beauty.ai launched the planet's first international beauty contest, judged solely by machines, running complex algorithms determining which faces most closely embody human beauty. 6,000 entries from 100 countries, a bunch of white women winning. The computers calculated beauty based on the data they were given. Data that did not include many people of color as a beauty baseline. An objective competition undone by unintentional bias. A beauty pageant is low stakes when compared to law enforcement, which has been trying to get the calculations right for a practice called predictive policing. At Hunch Lab, in the city of brotherly love, they believe they have algorithmic law enforcement down to a science.
So what we're looking at here is a demo instance using Philadelphia data. The software identifies locations that are good for you to go to based upon our risk analysis and policy about what's important to prevent that day. It's things like where are bars and bus stops and highway on-ramps and what day of the week is it and how many incidents happened in the last week, in the last month, things like that. So the different colors represent different types of crimes. So we're actually right here in our office, which is in one of these boxes, which is a blue box that represents theft from vehicles.
Okay.
So the officer can see that, you know, the theft from vehicles is about 1/3 of the risk. The yellow here is robbery, the dark blue is motor vehicle theft, etc. So if I was an officer, I'd go to this location and then I'm prompted to select a tactic. So the software can be configured with different types of tactics that could reflect the nature of, you know, police community interactions, issues, you know, things like that. So in this case, it's saying visit businesses or high visibility car patrol.
So these are the two choices. It's like choose your own adventure for law officers.
Yes.
Well, it sounds like the wave of the future, but what's the most valid criticism that you've ever heard of the work that you guys do here?
The decisions about what is going to be addressed and how it's going to be addressed by the police is immensely important for public debate to discuss. And that can't happen if no one knows that it's going on, right? So that transparency aspect, I think, is the most important aspect of that, and it's often lacking in this process.
Transparency was not a hallmark of a predictive policing program in New Orleans, where Palantir Technologies, an analytics firm co-founded by billionaire venture capitalist Peter Thiel, tested their software for 6 years, from 2012 through 18, without the knowledge of the city's residents or the bulk of the city council. 20 of the nation's 50 largest police departments employ predictive policing: LA, New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. A revelation that prompted the Brennan Center for Justice to undertake a 4-year court battle with the city's police department for information on just how the NYPD is using predictive policing.
If you flood an area with police officers, you're much more likely to find crime. If you take drug use, for example, we know that Americans of different races use drugs at about the same rate, but arrests for minor drug use are much higher in Black and Latino communities here. So there's a disparity already between enforcement. If you then put that data into a computer and ask it to draw patterns and predict where police are more likely to make an arrest for a drug crime, lo and behold, it's in those same neighborhoods that have been over-policed already. So it brings it right back to the bias and discrimination and bad data question. And that is critical here. We're worried about a police officer who might be racist, or a policy that's biased against minority populations or immigrant populations. And we look to a computer to remove that element of subjective bias. But again, it matters how you've trained that computer. The computer is only going to do what you tell it to do with the data that you give it.
I think that there's some clear decision-making processes in criminal justice that risk assessment tools are not being designed to solve in a fair, unbiased way, right? But there's also like human processes that also are broken, right? So if you are a judge and you are making a decision about some sort of summary judgment or something, right? Yeah. you can often see how many times a person has interacted with the police. And you might use that even subconsciously to change your decision-making process, right? Why should that person see that at all? In our system, we debate, how much information should we give to an officer? Will that information be interpreted correctly? Some competitors really believe that officers should have as much information as the system knows, right? When we looked at the map, some of those boxes are probably more risky than others. Yeah. You as an officer don't know which one is higher risk, which one is lower risk, right? And we're probabilistically selecting locations. So sometimes we're going to send an officer to a lower risk location, but they don't know it, right? So if they don't know which one's high risk and which one's medium risk, they can't use that information to change their behavior.
Right. To go around
and be like, something's definitely going to happen. I'm going to stop everyone and use this as justification. They can't.
In addition to, is this going to keep us safe? Is this going to exacerbate tensions that already exist in this city? Is it going to make it worse for communities that are already over-policed? Is it going to further erode trust between the police and the communities they serve, making it harder for them to solve crimes in the future?
So would New York City, as we know it, be a less safe environment than it is now if we were to rely more on these predictive policing modules?
So the predictive policing software, one of the big criticisms of it is that it's not always accurate either. And so you end up over-policing some communities, under-policing other communities, and diverting resources because the computer tells you to do that, rather than, say, community concern about a particular problem in the neighborhood that could receive more police attention. So it's a trade-off in terms of resources, and there are serious questions about the accuracy, about the reliability, about the bias inherent in these systems, and I think if police make their decisions based on that, then it is going to make us less safe. We're not opposed to technology, but we would like to know how this technology works and what its risks are, because right now that's not clear to anybody, but it is impacting the civil rights and civil liberties of millions of New Yorkers.
This digital portal, created by the folks at Shared Studios, collapses time and space, bringing Brooklyn face-to-face with Herat, Afghanistan. While many families wrestle with what's the right age to give kids their first phone, one of Brooklyn's most insular communities is grappling with whether or not technology should play any role in their lives. For one young woman in Flatbush, a smartphone may be a tool of resistance.
I grew up with no TV, no radio. I did not know what radio was. I grew up with never seeing a movie. I'm Frida Wiesel. I grew up in the Sapmar community, and I'm now a tour guide in Hasidic Williamsburg. I personally don't think that the secular community is doing a good job of telling the community story, and in part because this community doesn't want to tell their story. We have such a different way of looking at things that it's really hard to get into the minds of members of this community. There's always a sense of, if there's technology, how can we make sure that we remove anything that's dangerous from it? This is a cell phone shop in New York City, and what they are selling, what they're advertising, is a flip phone. The first and most reputable firm in the kosher phone industry. Email communication with absolutely no browsing capabilities.
I think that our community is still divided by those who are proponents for having access to a smartphone, having access to unify with other people of different backgrounds to come up with new ideas and new perspectives, and then the others who are just anti to the point where, like, a phone is literally the symbol of super saturated evil. There aren't that many Orthodox Jewish females who are in the spotlight, reaching for their camera and showing their face. Guys, why should I take the steps? That's way too boring. Let's show them how we roll, right? Right here we go. Farewell. I think that divide is slowly melting, because it's becoming impractical to live without a phone.
It's gotten into a lot of the community. It's caused a divide. There's like the haves and the have-nots. And you don't even know who they are. Within the same family, there are people making the decision to use smartphones, and there are people making the decision not to use smartphones.
Flatbush Girl is a character that I play to entertain an audience, create social commentary, to unify a very fragmented community. Managing Flatbush Media is maintaining clients, managing their social media presence for their business, ensuring that their end of the month sales are increasing. That occurs by me managing a group of people, my team, who make that happen. Did you understand that when we use an influencer, someone who's popular on Instagram, we post it in both places? One of my favorite kinds of businesses to come into and introduce to social media are the men, the owners who don't have access to smartphones, who don't use the internet, who don't use email. It's such a foreign place for them. I always have in mind, and we always have in mind, like your voice. It's a sage, it's someone who's wise, someone who has a lot of information to give to the customer. But for the males that I do interact with who do have WhatsApp, who do have Instagram, who do have email, it's kind of a difficult task to maintain my sense of power. I need to kind of bring this alpha dog nature, and it takes a lot of fight out of me. Okay, this is the issue. You do the photography lishma because you want to help Mr. Freund. Don't mistake your inability to ask them for more money with being passive aggressive towards me for me benefiting off of that inability.
No, I hear you. It comes out to, like, understand that it's $10 a photo.
I really appreciate it. I really do.
All right.
Thank you, AJ. Okay. We'll be in touch. Okay, bye-bye. In the summertime, I placed a thank you ad to one of the senators for being so active in the community and trying to clean up the community and clean up graffiti. That paper rejected the ad because my face was in it. They'll show females, but they'll blot out the face, they'll pixelate the face. Looking back on the way in which I was schooled in the female school system, it's how can the females service the males? How can the females perpetuate bigger growth amongst families and amongst the community to further the klal? It's a Hebrew word for the whole.
All Orthodox Jews know who she is. Adina can't even really walk down the street like, Flatbush Girl. Adina and I are of the opinion that if you just allow yourself to be an individual and a person, and people see you as an individual, as a person, they could choose to accept you or not.
You're not gonna help me? You're just gonna sit there reading? Get up and help me. Down.
I really don't feel comfortable, please.
Get over here, quickly, I'm gonna get 1,000 likes on this.
So embarrassed.
Hurry up. Remain, sit on deck.
Mayor de Blasio, I just have a question for you.
Yes?
Would you ever consider converting to Judaism and then changing your name to Mayor so you could be Mayor?
Mayor!
Isn't that a great
coming. That's a great idea.
Most of my haters are female. They see someone going against what we were raised to do. It's almost like we were all in like this slumber of, yeah, that's just the way it is. They're just, girls are not in magazines. Like, that's just it. Some of the messages that I get have even bordered into threats of physical harm, threats of physically harming my children.
We're just trying to be people. We're not trying to be Orthodox Jews first. Sometimes we do things very Orthodox Jewy, right? Because we can't lose that identity, and we're very proud of that identity.
And it's a classic picture of the story of Purim, in which Mordechai watched as the people in, I guess, Shushan were bowing as if they were worshiping idols. And this is not supposed to have a smartphone in the middle, but someone cropped a smartphone into it. And the message is very clear that if you engage with your smartphone, then it's like idol worship. Often the argument has been the Nushim Tzidkunias, the women, the pious women, are closer to the children, to the next generation. It's more important to keep them pure.
What's it called?
I don't know.
A symbol. A symbol. Say symbol. Good.
I always have this joke that we like to be like 10 years behind on things, like 10 years behind on fashion, 10 years behind on technology, even like the thought process, because everything gets filtered. And it has worked very well for the community. But the question is, how will they embrace it? Will they embrace it? How will they learn to deal with it? Because they haven't learned yet.
You are you. This is your one shot at life. You can't be on your deathbed and say, oh, I was there for my family, I was there for my kids, I was there for my parents, I was there for the community. Were you there for yourself? That's kind of what I want to achieve with my audience.
Lifelong learners interested in science have a home in Sunset Park, and it's called GenSpace. This may look like a typical street in Sunset Park, but it's really a portal to my sophomore year in high school, when my favorite subject was laboratory science. And like much of that year, I'm late to class.
So GenSpace is the world's first community biology lab. The community biology lab is a place where really anyone from any background can come, learn about biotechnology, and then go into the lab, which is all right behind you, and try biotechnology for the first time.
Okay, portals into the past are science fiction, but this space is very real and very well stocked. A former warehouse reborn as a playground for your inner nerd.
So GenSpace was the first one of these community biology labs. There are now 125 different groups around the world that are following in our footsteps.
You've done a lot to dispel this notion that technology in Brooklyn is just some kid who dropped out of college to really make his app fly.
No.
This is not that community. This looks like every person who stands next to me in the post office.
Yeah, and that's right. So, you know, one of the things that we want to do in a space like this is make it openly accessible to all different communities.
Will Schindel is the lab manager at GenSpace, and the day after orientation, he gave me a private tour.
In a lot of ways, biotechnology is similar to computing in that it's fairly cheap to actually do. And we found the biggest barrier to entry is just access to the technology. So places like this basically make that possible. I think CRISPR is probably the sexiest thing that we're all excited about these days.
Definitively, what is CRISPR and how is it going to change my life?
CRISPR is a tool that we use to edit genomes. And the way that we do it is basically, it's a little enzyme that you can basically reprogram. And from there, we rapidly figured out how to actually deploy it inside of live cells. It can scan the chromosome, find the sequence that it's been targeted to search out, and cut right there. Once that cut has been made, you can then provide new DNA for the cell to use to repair its own DNA with.
So I can like trade in my snoring for 20/20 vision?
One day.
One day may be sooner than you'd expect. Biotechnology is advancing so far, so fast, that we're approaching a before and after moment of evolutionary proportion. Imagine explaining the internet to Confucius, one of history's most brilliant minds. But how do you break down a Google search to someone who's never even seen a light bulb? Artificial superintelligence and runaway technology, forcing a giant leap forward, where old models fall to new reality and unimaginable changes to human civilization, referred to as the singularity.
When many people hear about CRISPR, their first thought is that it'll lead to either the singularity or the apocalypse. And that's one of the myths that we're trying to dispel here, is that it's a tool just like any other tool, and it will certainly advance technology, but it's not going to single-handedly change anything by itself.
Ruthie Nachmany is the prototypical citizen scientist, software engineer by day and biomaterial designer by night.
So about a year ago, I had this idea that I wanted to make wearable art that would organically change over time. And as I was thinking about this, I discovered the biotextiles class at GenSpace. So I took that, it was really cool. I learned about how people are making mushroom leather and like wearable algae and like using soybean bacteria to make clothes that open and close based on your body temperature. So I was like, this is amazing. And then from there I took the CRISPR class and learned about kind of contemporary forms of genetic engineering. And what I loved was I read a lot about CRISPR, but learning how to do it hands-on was so exciting.
Craig Trester is a mycologist working on a project for mushrooms to help heal the planet.
We know what species this is. This is blue oyster mushrooms.
Are they delicious?
Actually, they're incredibly tasty.
When's the last time you ate a mushroom?
Last night. We could use CRISPR to engineer the bacteria to fluoresce a certain color, which we could use in tracking of how effective the mycelium is consuming the bacteria, and potentially work with other people that are actually doing in-field remediation.
What makes Brooklyn so great is that there's so much going on, and people are really into interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinary research and activities. So we have designers and artists who are coming to this space and looking at biotechnology as their next palette. The next big breakthroughs, the next great applications in biotechnology are going to come through these kinds of collaborations.
With outlets like GenSpace providing the tools for citizen scientists to get their hands dirty in the service of biohacking, the future is now. Thanks for going in on technology with us. If you missed anything or want to check out past episodes of Going In, you can find us on one of these things at youtube.com/BRIC TV. Bye now. Every week, we go in. Emotional, in-depth, and unfiltered stories that explore the complexity of how we live. It's news worth knowing in the time it takes to tell it. So find us for new perspectives on the place you call home.